And now I would like to introduce Libby Copeland, who will interview Dani and serve as our moderator. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press, and I encourage you to read Libby's book also. It's terrific. Thanks so much, Dani and Libby, for coming today to speak to the Transition Network. Libby, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And I am so excited to be able to introduce Dani Shapiro. Just a little about her, if you don't already know, she's the author of Inheritance, which was an instant New York Times bestseller that came out in January of 2019. And her other books include memoirs, Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, and 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. Along with teaching writing workshops around the world, Dani has taught at Columbia, New York University, and she is the co-founder of the Siren Land Writers Conference in Positano, Italy. In February of 2019, she launched the original podcast Family Secrets, which is really good and you should check it out. If you haven't listened to it yet, it's scary addictive. It is an iTunes top 10 podcast, and it features stories from people like Dani, who've uncovered life-altering and long-hidden secrets from their family's past, and she lives with her family in Connecticut. I've had the pleasure and honor of getting to know Dani a little bit, not only through her work, but through talking to her, and as you'll see, if you don't already know, she is a thoughtful ethicist, a profoundly compelling writer, and a real student of the mind and the soul of the human impulses that push and pull all of us, that shape how we see the world and make us who we are. So I am thrilled to be here with Dani Shapiro. Welcome, Dani.
Thanks, Libby. It is so great to be with you and get to have another conversation about these deep things.
These important things, absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about this moment that we're in. So we are in a moment when tens of millions of Americans are trying to understand themselves by looking to the past, looking to their family histories, and looking at their own DNA. You tested a few years ago, somewhat on a lark, right? Your husband was doing some family history research and you kind of went along and decided to test yours. I was wondering if you could talk about the forces that you see as propelling so many of us to spit into a vial and engage in family history research at this moment in time.
That's a great question. I think listeners would be interested in knowing that this kind of recreational DNA testing has been, and I believe still is, the most popular holiday gift in America. It's one of the most one of the most popular hobbies, pastimes, fascinations that has really done nothing but grow over these last years. And I've actually heard recently during the time of this pandemic is even greater, that people they're home. We're home, we're delving into this stuff. We have time and everything has slowed down. I think part of it is this exponential, just people are doing it. And so it becomes part of the culture and part of what we're interested in. It also, I think, has a lot to do with the way that these companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe advertise them, what these discoveries are going to be like. They're going to be fun. You're going to find out that you're 1/8 Italian, or that you have 4th cousins that you didn't know about, and you can connect with people with whom you share distant relations. And I think also on the level of identity, we're living in a time where there's so much both confusion and focus on defining ourselves. And, how do we define ourselves? And, so much fluidity in the way that we define ourselves. And so the idea that we can actually trace back in a way that I think people hope will make them feel more grounded or more connected. We're also living in a time where families are often very fractured geographically, are not living generations in the same town, generations under the same roof. Stories get lost. And so I think there's very much a desire to find out what we can so that we'll connect in a deeper way.
Right. That makes sense. And there's something very American about that, I think, right?
Oh, well, I've been, the book has come out in other countries and I've been interviewed in a lot of other countries, and people in other countries are scratching their heads at the popularity in our country. I mean, really, in the UK, in Australia, in France, in Germany, it's really in Israel. I mean, it's really considered like, what do you mean this is the most popular holiday gift in the US? How is that possible? Why are people doing this? So yes, it's gaining popularity in other countries, but it's a distinctly American phenomenon.
Yes. Okay, so you tested and you found something that you very much were not expecting to find. And so much so that I think in the beginning you briefly thought that the results had to be an error. And we were actually just talking a little bit about this before we started the talk. People who haven't experienced a profound surprise that has to do with their own genetic identities or their immediate families, or there's something that's core to their central identity, they may not understand how profoundly a revelation can shake a person. And so I'm wondering if you could walk us through a little bit of the immediate emotional aftermath for you. Like, what is the landscape of it? How does it start? Could you even break it down into, I don't know, the Kubler-Ross, 7 stages of grief, right? Is there a kind of is there a template for you, at least you emotionally, in what you experience that others might find instructive?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I answer, I just also want to tell listeners that your book, The Lost Family, does such an incredible service to the hundreds of thousands of people who are having this experience, who, I mean, my book has as well, I know, but my book is a personal account that allows people into the emotional experience. But as a journalist, you actually were able to sort of take a step back and journalistically explore what that discovery is for people, which is one of the reasons I like talking to you so much. So yes, and I should also say to listeners, I'm going to say some things that, that if you read the book, you'll discover very, very quickly. They're not spoilers. It's not a book about like the aha of what happened. It's much more of the internal exploration of what does it mean? How did it happen? So after I spit into the vial and, really just on a whim, as you said, and my results came back, my results came back and they made no sense in terms of what I understood to be my ethnicity. I'm the only child of 2 Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. So and all of my relatives back on both sides of the family tree were Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. So I would have expected that I would have seen something close to like somewhere above 90% Eastern European Ashkenazi. And instead what I saw was around 50% Eastern European Ashkenazi, and the rest was this smattering of Western European, which people who are watching me speak right now would be like, well, duh. But I grew up with absolutely no reason to question what that ethnicity was. I basically thought, well, maybe all Jews, have much more complex genetic histories because of the diaspora and because of pogroms, and maybe this makes sense. So that was my first like little piece of denial. And then the next was, Ancestry.com must have made a mistake. They must have mixed up my vial with somebody else's. But as it's sort of like the noose kept tightening, I was really in denial. In fact, didn't even interest me. I put away the results and I thought, well, that was silly and a waste of $90 or whatever it was. Then a first cousin, a biological first cousin appeared on my Ancestry.com page. So for people who haven't done this testing, there's a little box that you check that most people do, because this is why we're doing these tests recreationally. The little box says, if other people share DNA with me, I would like to be connected with them. I would like to see them and for them to see me. So this first cousin appeared, you know, just a little icon, little blue icon, which meant it was a male first cousin. And I know all my first cousins. I had lots of first cousins on my father's side, and this wasn't one of them. So then I really thought Ancestry.com had gotten it wrong. And I ended up comparing my DNA, which is a very easy thing to do, with that of my half-sister, my father's daughter from an earlier marriage. And what came back instantly was that she and I were not related, which means that she and I did not share a father, which I very, very quickly, immediately came to understand meant that my dad, who I adored and had been dead for a very long time, had not been my biological father. So that moment, well, first of all, that was the moment that I made my husband call Ancestry.com and get a supervisor on the phone, because I was even more certain that a terrible error had been made. But something within me started to know that it was true. And aspects of my history started like lining up like dominoes, just like within me. I thought, well, this anecdote connected to that anecdote, connected to that thing my mother said when I was 25, to not looking like anyone in my family. So and both of my parents were gone, so there was no one directly to ask. It was a feeling of shock that was different from any kind of shock that I'd ever experienced. And I had experienced some shock in my life, but this was like a groundlessness. I felt like I didn't know where I came from after a lifetime of thinking I knew. And that certainty, I mean, one of the things that I've learned over the course of these last couple of years, I've thought deeply about identity. And our identities are formed by stories. They're formed by the stories that we're told from the time that we have any consciousness. So if, for example, we're adopted, and assuming our parents are not withholding that from us, we're told from a very young age that we're adopted, that, you know, maybe some details about that, maybe not, but, you know, we're your adoptive parents and we love you, and but we're not your biological parents. If we are raised with biological parents, the stories are around we are a family who are genetically related to each other. If something in that origin story is hidden or secret or not true, the identity of the person who it's being withheld from actually is like becomes sort of warped, because it's wrapping itself around something that is an omission or a deception or a lie or a secret. And so the feeling was, it made perfect sense to me. It was like I put on the right prescription glasses for the first time and I saw it all, but it also meant that I had been just fundamentally wrong about my history. And just to add on to that, my father came from a kind of illustrious and a family that was very conscious of its own posterity, as I write in the book. So I had been raised with stories about my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents. And there were portraits all over my house of these ancestors. And there was even a documentary film that contained some footage of my grandfather and great-grandfather going back to the shtetl in Eastern Europe and praying at the grave of my great-great-grandfather. All of that was actually very important to me, more important than it is to many people. And as a writer, I had written a great deal about my family and about my father, really trying to understand him because I lost him so young, and there were just things about him that were mysterious to me that I was always trying to make sense of. So the process was moving through from shock, literally dizziness. Like I was walking into walls. I was walking off curbs. It's a trauma. Most people who have experienced it would describe it that way, on the level of identity, not because biology is the only thing that matters, but because it was a secret that was kept. And, I went to doctors and gave incorrect medical history for my entire life, for myself and for my own son. There was so much that I didn't know. So I guess like stage-wise, it moved. Then I was angry because I felt that I had been, that something really, really fundamental that I had a right to know had been kept from me. And a huge part of the deep dive that I did in inheritance was trying to figure out as best as I could what my parents knew, what they kept from me, if they kept it from me, whether maybe one of them knew and one of them didn't, maybe neither of them did, maybe both of them did. Where did it live in them? And in exploring where it lived in them and exploring so much of the time that they lived in, which resulted in the choices they made, which resulted in my existence, I was able to come to know them better. And, I hesitate to use the word forgive because I'm not even sure forgiveness is in order. It was more like I came to understand these were my parents before I was born. These were the choices that they made as creatures of their time, in the late 1950s and early 1960s that resulted. And, we can look back at some of those choices and go like, oh my God, but we'd be looking back at them from our vantage point as modern, contemporary, psychologically sophisticated people. And this isn't the world that they lived in. So there was also this incredible gift in it. And the gift was, I got to know my parents better.
Wow. Okay. So one of the things that you talk about in the book is this, this childhood sense that something was amiss. And then I saw you actually came to my hometown and right around when your book came out in the hardcover, and you did a literary salon, and you talked about this idea that, you felt like on some level you always knew because you were always writing about family history and excavation of the past and secrets. And I guess I do wonder about, I'm very curious about that, this notion that on some level, however conscious that a person might have a sixth sense that something isn't exactly what they thought. Do you think, it sounds like you think that's the case for you. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about that. And also if you think that's the case for other people that you've talked to.
Yeah. One of the both painful and liberating things that I came to realize was that there was a lot about my experience as a child that I didn't understand at the time. And I never really understood, I went to therapy. I tried to understand, never really understood. And it was this feeling of not quite fitting in, not belonging. I grew up in this Orthodox family. We were observant. We went to synagogue and, regularly, especially with my dad. And it wasn't just that I was told every day of my life that I didn't look Jewish, which I was every day. But it was a feeling of otherness, a feeling of like something's not right. And when a child feels that way, and there's no story to support that, then the child really turns it on herself. There must be something wrong with me that I feel this way, because there's nothing to hang it on. There's nothing that makes any sense. And so it really impacted the way that I felt as a kid, as a teenager, as a young adult. It was the backbeat of a lot of my life. And I feel fortunate that I was able to survive that feeling and move on from it, and I think a lot of that had to do with becoming a writer, make a successful life for myself, have a contented and happy marriage, become a mother, be a good enough mother to my own child. But that feeling of I don't understand why, that persisted. And I will say, like, one of the things that I felt very quickly after my discovery, even through the shock, even through the pain, it was like, oh, that makes so much sense now. And, when I started going on book tour for Inheritance, which happened pretty much from day one in January of 2019 and didn't stop until the pandemic. I mean, I probably did well over 100 appearances all over the country. And many, many people came to my events who had similar stories, because there are hundreds of thousands of people who are making these discoveries, as you know. And everyone that I talk to, without exception, shares that feeling. That feeling of otherness, apartness, not quite fitting into their family, not understanding why, and then making this discovery. Because here's the thing, and maybe this will help illuminate this a little bit. If, in biological families, we take for granted that there are similarities, mannerisms. My son walks just like my husband. He looked just like me at a certain age. Now he looks a whole lot more like my husband. He has gestures, but we never, in biological families, you don't sit and think about that. It just is. And there's a familiarity. That's just the case. In families that are not biological families, where this is known, the absence of that is understood. I don't look like you, I don't walk like you, I don't gesture like you. That doesn't mean that there isn't this like gigantic amount of nurture that actually, is hugely relevant and important. But that piece, the genetic biological piece, is understood to be not there. If someone has not been told either that they were a secret affair, the product of a secret affair, or donor conceived, which was the case for me, or late discovery adoptees. There's a huge number of late discovery adoptees. If they were never told, then they're going through life with that feeling of unfamiliarity, but not knowing why. And so it's a very, very common feeling that people report after they make these discoveries.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it's interesting that you hear that then from people coming up to you saying, I feel the same thing. So one of the things you talk about in the book, and much of the book centers on this kind of detective work, this archaeology of the past that you have to do in order to understand how you came to be who you are and what your parents knew. And that's sort of one of the central questions of the book. And to do that, you're talking to a lot of folks who are in their 80s and 90s. And you are concerned that there's a quote, it says, how old was too old to blow up the past rather than keep it intact. So I wanted to ask you about the process that you went through when you're thinking, you're researching yourself, and you're wondering whether the revelation of your truth is a force for good or something that could potentially hurt somebody else. How do you balance that? How did you balance that? And how did you think through that process of knowing when to impart information, when to ask questions, when to hold back?
That was a process too, because in the very beginning, I was not really thinking about the moral or ethical implications of contacting people. For example, trying to find and then finding my biological father, right? I wasn't thinking about the ethical implications or well, I'll say something about that in a second. I was trying to save myself. I had the ethics of a drowning person at that moment. The ethics of a drowning person. I was desperate to know what I could. I was afraid that if I waited, I've heard stories where people find their biological father and then they've died the week before. I wanted to know what I could. I felt like I was Humpty Dumpty who had fallen off the wall, and I was just trying to put myself back together again. But within that, I will say that I was very careful. I don't know how I knew to be so careful, but when I initially wrote an email to the man who I very quickly came to be able to figure out was my biological father, I put myself in his shoes. I wondered to myself, what would it be like to be a 78-year-old retired physician with a family of his own, opening his email one day, expecting to see like his country club dues and, some political entreaties, and instead, or in addition, also get an email from a woman, a perfect stranger, saying, I think I'm your biological daughter. I thought about what that would be like. And so and maybe that's because as a writer and as a journalist myself and as a novelist, I've spent my life putting myself in other people's shoes. So I put myself in his shoes. And so when I wrote, I'd let him know that I would be very respectful of his privacy. I began by saying this may come as a shock. I let him know that I meant no harm, that I came in peace, that I didn't want anything from him. Because I think I intuitively knew, I don't know how I knew this, but I intuitively knew that to get an email like that out of the blue, many people experience initially as a threat. It's completely threatening to suddenly have, one thing we're pretty sure of is we know who our children are. We know who our parents are, we know who our children are, we know who our relatives are, and then suddenly there's somebody, complete stranger in our midst, saying, you're my biological father. So all the way through our story, I think the reason why it turned out to be as good a story and as generous a story as it did is because the people involved, meaning myself, my biological father, his family, were very focused on trying to do the right thing, on trying to be kind, on thinking about this ethical question: what do you owe a perfect stranger with whom you share such a profound biological connection? Because it is profound, no matter, we'd like to pretend it isn't sometimes, but nature does matter. The very first time that I laid eyes on my biological father was on a YouTube video, and he was gesturing with his hands, and he was gesturing exactly in the same way that I've gestured all my life. It's like, it was recognition and familiarity, which is something that I realized with a complete start was something I had never seen before. Anyone else involved in the story, the other elderly people that I contacted, whether it was elderly relatives of mine or elderly physicians who might have known something during that time, endocrinologists or people involved in the field of infertility, that I knew that my calls might be surprising, but I didn't think that I was doing anything that would be upsetting to people. so but it was this quest to know and to find out everything that I could as quickly as I could. Again, because it did feel like, my husband and I had this running joke because I didn't like making the calls. They scared me. They were, I don't like picking up the phone and calling people who, I don't know how journalists do it all the time, who maybe aren't going to want to hear from me. And I would hesitate, and my husband would say, he may be dead by Friday. And I would get over my reticence and pick up the phone because my desire to know was very powerful.
I want to talk to you a little bit about this fear of the stranger, right? This fear of the stranger who shares our genetic material, because you experience that as the stranger walking into a family, and many other people have experienced this as well. And I don't even know what it would have been like for your genetic father had he discovered, as some do, excuse me, my apologies, that he had 20 donor children, right? And that certainly alters the calculus. But for him, as far as we know, there was one, and that's you. And I'm curious if you have thoughts, sort of, from your deep knowledge of human psychology. Where does that fear of the stranger come from when the person walking into your life is not genetically a stranger, and there seems to be this assumption sometimes that the person wants something, but nefarious. But what exactly that is, you never quite know. But there's this sense of boundaries being violated, and I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I've heard many stories exactly like that. What do you want from me? And even in families where there's no wealth or anything like that, it's still like, what, you want my money? I've heard stories where the person who makes the discovery about biological parentage is someone who's extremely well-to-do, and the biological parent isn't, and it's still, what do you want from me? Do you want my money? It leads me to believe that it's primitive. That we weren't really, men have always had children walking around that they didn't know about. That's been true since the beginning of time, but they were never going to know about them. This world of DNA testing plus the internet is, it's like a Molotov cocktail. It's blown everything sky high. And the idea, so for example, in the world of infertility medicine in the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 1980s, it was understood that no one would ever know. It would be impossible. It would be like something out of a science fiction dystopian novel, that there could be this thing called the internet, and there could be, people knew about DNA at that point, but it was very new. And the idea that it could ever be discoverable, so I think that the secret of it, my biological father, who is an extremely thoughtful and erudite person, and in fact has a specialty in ethics himself, which is goes into the department of you can't make this stuff up. He told me at some point that he never gave any thought to the possibility that a biological child might ever contact him. And this is after, a decade plus of DNA testing being available. You'd think that people who had donated would suddenly be thinking, gosh, I wonder. But they didn't, because at the time, it was made into this is nothing. This is no more than donating blood. It's nothing more than donating, a kidney or a retina. It doesn't mean anything. So I think that that's a piece of it. I also think that there's shame involved. Whenever there's a secret, and look, I really learned this. I've been a student of secrets as a writer my whole life, as you said. And that's very interesting to me. Why? Well, I think I have much better understanding of why now. I was the secret. But and now with the podcast, with Family Secrets, I've learned a lot. And when there are secrets, there is invariably shame underneath the secret. Why keep the secret otherwise? Really? I mean, even if it's under the guise of it's going to hurt someone, or, let sleeping dogs lie, or what we don't know doesn't hurt us, which I really vehemently disagree with. I mean, what I didn't know did hurt me.
Hmm.
But I think that there's shame. I think, there's shame if someone has put up a child for adoption, and they have that haunting feeling. And so there are people who, are contacted by their biological children who don't want to have anything to do with them. Then there are people who are thrilled beyond belief. There's the range, there's the gamut, but still there's that initial feeling of, what do you want? Scare, being fear, primitive fear. And then with donors, with egg donors, sperm donors, there's this combination of, well, this was never supposed to ever come out, and also shame because of that little word donor. I mean, what's really being said there is you were paid. You made a little pocket change when you were in medical school. And there's kind of an embarrassment or an untoward, unsettled feeling about that. So I think that all of that, and as I said before, the sense that we know who our family, the contours of our family, and we're very committed to those contours. It takes an awful lot to shake that up in any way. And meanwhile, those are our families, the families who raised us and who we spent our lives on the planet with. Those are our families. So then it also upends our definition. So then what does it mean then? So who is this person to me? They're not my family. I don't love them. They're a stranger, but I'm looking at somebody who's so familiar to me that it's absolutely surreal.
Okay, so this goes to something I wanted to ask you about, which is this this question, of what makes me, this age-old nature nurture. You said something earlier that pushed back at the notion that that this is, at least for you, reinforcing the primacy of biology over experience and over intention and over love, right? That it is important, but it's not more important than the other stuff. At least that's what I heard you saying. And so I wonder, for those of us who haven't gone through this experience where we've had to wrestle with this question of who am I and what's the greater influence, have you come, I apologize, I meant to mute this and I managed not to. Have you come to a sense of greater clarity, around which forces made you who you are?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Libby. And it is ongoing, and I think it will be ongoing probably for the rest of my life. I feel like I am a thought experiment in nature versus nurture. Like I actually am. Like I remember among the many people that I talked to when I was writing Inheritance were several rabbis who were in my life or in my family's life. And one of them, Rabbi David Wolpe in LA, he said to me, everyone feels other. You've gone to the front of otherness and you've come back with something to teach us, which I heard as Rabbi Wolpe almost challenging me. Like, this is your lot in life. This is what has been, this is your life. Like these are the lessons that have been like laid in your lap. Doesn't happen to everybody. What are you gonna, and you're a writer and a public person who's been writing about this stuff since, you're in your 20s. What are you gonna do with this? And, I think initially I was very interested initially in the nature piece because it was new for me. It was new. I mean, in a piece of irony, I really take after my biological father much more than I take after my biological mother. My mother and I, as people who have read my books know, were not a great match as mother and daughter. She is my mother. I checked. I actually had, I was like, I need a tent pole. Like, I had an elderly cousin of her, of ours on her side do the spit thing. And like, I just needed to know for sure, although nothing else made sense. So I actually, nature-wise, was seeing some of what makes me me for the first time. My biological father is a reader, a writer, a thinker. We had the same favorite novel. He reads poetry. He has. There was just a lot that was like, how do I make any sense of that? That this stranger living on the other side of the country, much of my constitution comes from him, and I was very interested in that because it was new. Over these years, and my father, my dad, who raised me, I have had a soul connection with from the time that I was born. He was the parent who saved me. And he died suddenly and tragically when I was 23, and he was in his 60s. And I internalized him, and he has always been this huge part of my inner life. And I had the experience, you and I are having this conversation a week after the Jewish high holidays. I had this experience last week of virtually going to Yom Kippur services, which I haven't done in years because I've been, after my son was bar mitzvahed, I sort of like just let a lot of it go, but I've always had a very spiritual life, but was disconnected from organized Judaism. I'm there in my home weeping for 24 hours because the language and the prayers and the Yisker, which is the prayer for the dead, and the candles that I lit for both of my parents, it was so powerful for me. And for days afterward, I couldn't get the Hebrew out of my head because I grew up fluent in Hebrew. I grew up with, as I said the next day to my very elderly aunt, my Aunt Shirley, my father's younger sister, who's 95, 96 years old, I said, I never understood. I didn't necessarily grow up believing, but I believed in my father's belief. And that was hugely formative for me. That relationship was hugely formative for me. And so the conclusion to this point that I've come to, which I think will continue to evolve, is that it took 3 people to make me. My mother was my mother, my dad who raised me, who I describe in the book as loving me into being, and this man who I refer to, I change his name in the book as Ben Walden. I wouldn't be here without him. And I'm a lot like this person who I never knew. And I lucked out too, because, he's pretty great. So I feel but he doesn't feel like my father at all. He does not feel like my father. He feels intensely familiar. I know that he is my biological father, but to go back to what that means, the people, what one of the things has changed, if this is not too esoteric, is my relationship to my ancestors. That has changed because if you think about it, ancestors who we didn't know, who we didn't share time together living, they are stories. They are the received stories that were told. And so all of those Shapiro ancestors, they were stories that I was told. And I internalized those stories, so they are a part of me. But then, like, now I know who my ancestors are on this other side of my biological makeup. And they came to this country as settlers. And they settled part of New England. And I was in a particular area a few weeks ago, which is one of the areas that they settled. And I was able to go see this house that was the oldest house in this particular area that biological ancestors of mine literally like built. And did I feel something? No, I felt a fascination. I felt like, wow, like those are ancestors whose stories I now have as well. I don't feel connected to them the way that I feel connected to the people of the shtetl. And they never would have known each other. I mean, that's another strange thing in the world of fertility medicine and donors is my mother and my biological father never would have hooked up. Like, their people would never have like connected. And so that's kind of fascinating too, because it's like, that's just the truth of it, is that's what made me.
Yeah.
And there's a increasingly deep sense of peace in that. To go back to your really great earlier question about the stages, I feel more at peace now than I ever have in my whole life because I know the truth.
Mm.
And as corny as this is going to sound, the truth really does set us free. There's a reason why that's, sort of an aphoristic kind of, like, it really does. There was stuff that I did not know that was integral to who I am as a human being. And I had to kind of walk through a lot that was hard and really dig into trying to understand as much as I could. But I did. And I feel so grateful that I was able to. And that, as you said, if I were one of 20 offspring or 30 or 50, which exists, this would be a very different story.
So I want to remind people, if they have questions in the chat, questions to put them into the chat, and I will read them off if there's time. And so I'm curious, when you spit into a vial, you were actually in some sense testing on behalf of other people, right? Because because you have overlapping genetic segments with your third cousins whose names you might not even know. And I'm curious if you feel like if there's any duty, I don't know, to our genetic relatives to ask permission or notify before we test. I asked someone who has tested and never done any of those things, never notified anyone, but I'm sort of curious now that you've been through this, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, that horse has fled the barn.
It's totally.
That's never going to happen. It's too late. And one of the really interesting questions that I often get from people is, or a comment really is, well, I'm never going to do that DNA testing because I don't want people to be able to find me. And I find myself often in the position of being the bearer of bad news. It doesn't matter whether you've tested or not. Your cousin, your brother, your grandchild, your uncle, your second cousin, anyone. I mean, in the case of my biological father, a nephew of his had done the genetic testing, and that's how I was able to find him, and very easily find him. And so, I think it's upending, it's creating kind of a reckoning in a lot of families, because not everyone in a family has the same desire for knowledge or, transparency, or they may have secrets. I mean, that's often the way that those secrets are coming out, is like, what do you mean grandma had another, child, or, what do you mean, that it seems like Uncle so-and-so must be the biological father of this person, or whatever it is. It's happening all the time, because, I mean, there's a reason why Family Secrets became such a popular podcast. It's not just the fascination with secrets, it's that so many families have them, maybe not on this scale, but, but we find them out, especially as the generations go back. But it's too late for that.
Yeah, it's too late. Yeah, I agree with you. Somebody asks here if you're familiar with Lacey Schwartz Delgado's film about A Little White Lie, and somebody writes that yes, you indeed interviewed her on one of your podcast episodes, and I think I heard that episode. It was fascinating.
Yeah, Lacey's film Little White Lie, somebody told me about early on when I was researching and writing Inheritance, and I watched it, and I remember there was this moment, Lacey the filmmaker is the subject of her own film, and she's half Black, but she was raised in a white Jewish family with nobody saying that and nobody commenting on that, and in fact she had no idea until she was well into high school. And I remember turning, and there's this footage where you see this child being born to this Jewish family in Woodstock, New York, and it's clear that one of that child's parents must be Black, but nobody's saying a word. And I said to my husband after watching the film, well, I mean, that denial goes even deeper than mine. And my husband was like, yeah, not really. Pretty much around the same. And so I loved the film, and I actually then later when I started the podcast, I asked Lacey to be my guest in first season of Family Secrets, if anybody wants to listen to that episode. And yeah, it's a very similar story. The details are always different, but it's a similar story.
Somebody posted a link, so if anyone wants to go into the chat, there's a link here to that particular podcast episode, and so you can check it out. And it's a great podcast. I think we have time for probably just about one or two more questions. So I am curious, because there may be people listening to this who have or will discover something unexpected. They're going to do a DNA test, or someone close to them in their genetic orbit is going to do it. And I'm curious if you have advice for somebody at the beginning of their journey, something they should absolutely do, something they should absolutely not do.
You're saying advice for somebody who's made a discovery.
Who's made a discovery about perhaps something unexpected about their immediate family or themselves.
I would say, to take a few breaths before doing anything. I did impulsively, very quickly write to my biological father, but I somehow had the presence of mind to write a letter that he was able to receive, at least over, if not immediately, eventually. I had somebody recently tell me that the letter that I wrote him, the email that I wrote him, that I include the text in my book, they actually use as a template to write to their own newly discovered biological father, which was kind of amazing thing. But I think the taking a step back and not operating out of one's own initial sort of seismic shock and fear and anger, allowing, like thinking about putting yourself in the shoes of others and how you would want to be treated if you were that person. Kindness goes a really, really long way in these stories. And also understanding that not everybody is going to have the same point of view. Sometimes discovering a secret like this ends up sort of heartbreakingly putting someone in the position of then having to be the secret and keep the secret because they don't want to hurt someone's feelings. So it's very tricky, but I've seen these stories really change in the fullness of time. To not assume that whatever it is on this very day is how it's going to stay.
So that it can be that you, this person in the position of reaching out, and the people who are on the receiving end have two totally different timelines.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's evidenced even in my book that, it took my biological father longer to get to the idea that this was significant and that he also had a stake in it than it took me. I mean, it was significant and it had a stake in it the second I made that discovery. For him, not so much. And for some people in that position, the answer to that is kind of never, which is very, very painful. And then one other thing I would say is that there is another category of people that we haven't really touched upon, which is that there are many, many parents, still living parents, who have not told their children the truth of their genetic identity, who either decided that they were never going to tell or just never got around to it and then it seemed too late. I know this because many, many, many of these people have reached out to me. They've come to my events or they've read my book and then it's informed what they've decided to do. But those kinds of reckonings are happening all over this country constantly because these people are still living and they have a choice about whether they're going to tell their children the truth of their identity or not. And it's going to be hard. But what they're realizing is that because of this world that we're all living in, their children are going to find out. The question is really only a matter of when.
Right. When and how, right?
Yeah.
That delivery of information that can make a difference in how you receive it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's very close to 4 o'clock, so I'm going to invite Debbie to come on and see if she's wanting us to ask another question or wrap up here. I'm going to let you take over for a bit, Debbie.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for joining us. And have a great rest of the day, and everyone, please stay safe.
Dani, thank you so much for
Libby,
talking. So
I loved the conversation.
amazing.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
You were great. Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye, everyone.